In the early 1940s, when America's railroads were the veins of industry, every major rail company claimed to know exactly what the future of freight looked like. Stronger locomotives, yes. More efficient locomotives, absolutely. But bigger? Bigger was seen as reckless, impractical, a fantasy from engineers who'd spent too many nights staring at drafting tables. So when whispers started circulating that Union Pacific was planning something unprecedented, something enormous, its rivals dismissed the idea outright. They laughed, scoffed, and said no railroad would ever need a machine that size. But inside Union Pacific's Omaha headquarters, the mood was very different. Because their trains weren't struggling on paper, they were struggling on mountains, specifically the brutal Wasatch Range, where steep grades devoured horsepower and pushed even the strongest locomotives to their limits. Freight was backing up, delays were growing, and the railroad needed something stronger than anything built before. Something powerful enough to lift a fully loaded freight train out of the mountains without ever needing a helper engine. Union Pacific didn't need a bigger locomotive because they wanted to make headlines. They needed it because the geography demanded it. So in 1940, Chief Mechanical Engineer Otto Jobelmann assembled a team and delivered a single, staggering directive: design the largest, strongest, most capable steam locomotive the world has ever seen. The team began sketching ideas that looked less like conventional locomotives and more like iron giants. 2 enormous sets of 8 driving wheels, a boiler so long it needed articulation just to navigate curves, a frame strong enough to support nearly 600 tons of steel and machinery. And above all, the power to drag massive freight consists of 1.14% grades at speeds other locomotives could only dream of. Competitors mocked them. Too long, too heavy, too complicated. Some even claimed the tracks themselves would buckle under such a machine, but Union Pacific didn't back down. Instead, they doubled down, refining, recalculating, and proving on paper that this behemoth was not only possible, but necessary. And within months, the design had a name, one born from a chalk note scrawled across the blueprint by an impressed worker. Big Boy. The rivals' laughter would soon fade, because the moment this locomotive rolled out of the Alco factory, the era of what people thought steam power could do was about to change forever. When the first detailed blueprints of the Big Boy reached the American Locomotive Company, Alco, engineers paused in disbelief. They were used to challenging designs. They had built some of the most formidable locomotives of the steam era. But this was something different, something bolder, something that felt like it was trying to rewrite the limits of physics themselves. Before anyone cut a single piece of steel, Alco engineers ran calculations again and again. Could a boiler stretching over 130 feet really maintain the necessary steam pressure? Would 16 massive driving wheels stay balanced at high speeds? Could the articulated frame handle the twisting mountainous terrain without tearing rails out of the ground? Rival companies insisted the answer to all of those questions was no. But that only strengthened Union Pacific's resolve to prove that it was yes. The construction process began with the heart of the machine, its boiler. This wasn't just a scaled-up version of a normal boiler. It was a pressure vessel so immense it required new forging techniques, new lifting equipment, and new welding methods. Alco workers built massive support structures around it, scaffolding that wrapped the boiler like the skeleton of a skyscraper. Men crawled inside the steel chamber with torches, laying down welds thicker than a man's hand. Then came the driving wheels, 8 on each engine set, each wheel weighing over a ton. Workers machined them to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Because if even one wheel wobbled, the entire locomotive could shake itself apart. The frame alone weighed more than many completed locomotives. When it was swung through the air by overhead cranes, workers described it as watching a battleship keel being lowered onto rails. Piece by piece, the Big Boy took shape. The firebox big enough to host a dinner party, the pistons the size of tree trunks, the twin sets of cylinders built to gulp steam like a living creature. Every day, crowds gathered at Alco's Schenectady plant just to watch. They didn't fully understand what they were looking at, but they could sense its significance. And on a cold morning in 1941, after months of precision work, the final bolt was torqued, the paint sprayed, and the brass lettering polished. The largest steam locomotive the world had ever seen stood ready for its first breath. What happened during that first test would silence every critic still laughing. The morning of the big boy's first test run felt electric. Word had spread throughout Alco's Schenectady plant. The giant was coming alive. Workers who had spent months assembling the machine lined the tracks. Others climbed onto rooftops for a better view. Rival engineers from competing railroads had quietly slipped into the crowd, determined to witness, if not sabotage, the test that could redefine locomotive design forever. When the firemen opened the firebox door, a wave of heat spilled out like a furnace awakening. Coal was shoveled in by the ton, feeding the enormous appetite of a boiler built to generate over 6,000 horsepower. Steam pressure climbed slowly at first, then faster, then steadily toward the danger zone that only a machine this size could safely handle. At 300 psi, the big boy exhaled its first great blast of steam. The crowd fell silent. Engineers checked every gauge, every valve, every bearing. If anything went wrong today, if a weld cracked, if a piston seized, if the frame flexed too far, the rivals waiting in the shadows would have endless ammunition to declare the entire project a failure. But when the throttle cracked open, the locomotive didn't lurch, wobble, or strain. It moved like a creature waking from sleep. Smooth, steady, confident. The 16 driving wheels rolled forward in perfect synchronization. The articulated frame pivoted fluidly around the curve. And within seconds, the big boy glided down the test track with a grace no one had expected from a 600-ton monster. That's when the real test began. A string of fully loaded freight cars, far more than any locomotive of the time was supposed to handle alone, was coupled behind it. The big boy's firebox roared, the throttle opened wider, and slowly the enormous train began to move. 10 cars, 20, 40, 60. The load kept growing. Rival railroads insisted the entire concept was flawed, that a locomotive this size would snap couplers, destroy rails, or stall on the slightest grade. But instead the speed climbed, 5 miles per hour, 10, 15, then 20. The wheels dug in, the boiler thundered, and the earth itself seemed to vibrate as the big boy kept accelerating. Alco engineers exchanged looks of disbelief. The critics weren't just wrong, they weren't even close. And Union Pacific, watching from afar, now understood they had a machine capable of rewriting the rules of American freight. When Big Boy number 4000 rolled west toward the Wasatch Range for its first assignments, it wasn't just another locomotive entering service. It was a challenge thrown directly at the mountains that had long defied Union Pacific. The Wasatch grades were notorious. Climbing out of Ogden, Utah meant facing 1.14% slopes that dragged freight speeds to a crawl. Previous locomotives had required helper engines, mid-train boosters, or slow, exhausting double-head operations. The big boy was supposed to end all of that. As the locomotive approached its first real climb, dozens of railroad workers gathered along the line. For years, they had watched locomotives strain, groan, and stall on the very grade the big boy was about to attack. Some doubted the hype. Others were quietly rooting for the new machine to succeed. And almost all of them wondered whether a locomotive this massive would even stay balanced on the twisting ascent. When the grade began to rise, the engineer opened the throttle, not dramatically, but with a steady confidence. The sound that followed didn't resemble a normal exhaust beat. It was deeper, richer, almost volcanic. 16 drivers bit into the rail, the articulated frame pivoted around the first sweeping curve, and the climb began. 10 miles per hour, 11, 12, the speed held. No slipping, no strain, just raw, controlled power. The firemen worked tirelessly, shoveling and monitoring the automatic stoker, feeding the boiler enough coal to keep the enormous steam pressure steady. Inside the cab, the temperature soared, but the crew's excitement built with every mile they gained. At the summit of the Wasatch, men who had gathered for the spectacle stared in disbelief as the big boy crested the ridge without assistance. A feat that many had said was physically impossible had just been achieved as casually as a stroll through town. Over the next weeks, the locomotive repeated the performance again and again, hauling longer, heavier, and at higher sustained speeds than anything in the West. Rivals, who once mocked the project, scrambled to understand how Union Pacific had managed it. They reviewed engineering journals, studied photographs, and sent inspectors to observe the big boy in action. But there was no secret trick, no clever workaround. The truth was simpler and far more devastating to competitors. Union Pacific had built a machine perfectly matched to its terrain, and the mountains the railroads once feared became the proving ground that turned the big boy into a legend. As months passed, the big boys settled into the demanding routine for which they had been created, moving heavy wartime freight over punishing grades at unprecedented speeds. What shocked rival railroads wasn't just their power, it was their reliability. Steam locomotives of the era were known for quirks, sudden bearing failures, overheating, boiler stress, and axle cracks. Any one of those issues could sideline an engine for days, but big boys, they just kept running. Crews quickly learned that the locomotive's enormous boiler was more than a bragging point. It kept temperatures stable and steam pressure consistent even under grueling loads. The articulated frame handled curves with a smoothness that surprised even seasoned engineers, and the massive firebox, fed by an efficient mechanical stoker, kept a constant ocean of heat washing through the tubes. All of this translated into performance numbers that sounded fictional. Big boys regularly pulled freight trains exceeding 3,000 tons, sometimes pushing past 4,000, without helpers. They held 25 to 30 miles per hour on grades where other locomotives crawled at walking speed. And on flat ground, they could sprint at over 60 miles per hour, a speed unheard of for machines this heavy. Railroad magazines published articles questioning the reports. Rivals sent spies disguised as photographers. Many insisted Union Pacific was exaggerating. Then came the endurance tests. In one stretch, a big boy logged over 1,000 miles in a single day, hauling wartime freight non-stop, pounding out mile after mile of uninterrupted service. Another ran nearly a month with no major maintenance, an achievement almost unheard of for a steam locomotive. Crews described them as tiring, but only because the engines were relentless. They didn't slow down unless the crew needed a break. And as their performance became undeniable, the ridicule from rival railroads transformed into frustration and then reluctant respect. Companies that once dismissed the big boy as a wasteful experiment began quietly revising their own locomotive programs. Some attempted to build competitors, but none could match the combination of power, speed, and endurance Union Pacific had achieved. The big boy wasn't simply breaking records, it was redefining what a steam locomotive could be. And it was becoming clear to everyone that this machine wasn't just built to outrun its rivals, it was built to outlast them. By the late 1940s, the big boys had become fixtures across the harsh geography of the American West. Crews knew them, trusted them, and respected them. Small towns along the Union Pacific line recognized the sound of their deep exhaust long before the locomotive came into view. Children would race to the tracks just to watch the mechanical giant thunder past, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Even adults, many of whom worked in the railroad industry their entire lives, never quite got used to the spectacle. Yet for all their fame, the big boys still had something to prove: whether they could continue dominating the rails in a world rapidly shifting toward diesel power. Diesel-electric locomotives were lighter, cleaner, more economical. Rival railroads promoted them as the future, insisting steam engines were dinosaurs clinging to life, and at first glance it seemed the critics might finally have an angle. How could a 600-ton steam locomotive compete with the rising tide of diesel technology? But when it came to raw, unforgiving mountain freight service, the big boy remained unmatched. Diesels of the era struggled to maintain high horsepower at altitude. They couldn't deliver continuous power on steep grades without overheating, and the early models often needed multiple units linked together just to attempt what a single big boy could do alone. Union Pacific engineers conducted direct comparisons. They placed new diesel engines on the same grades with the same loads and measured everything: speed, endurance, fuel use, cooling performance. The results were undeniable. While diesels were more efficient in flatter territory, they couldn't match the big boy in the mountains. Meanwhile, the steam giants continued breaking internal company records. One big boy hauled a 3,600-ton freight for over 64 miles at an average speed previously believed impossible. Others demonstrated astonishing agility for machines. Their size, tackling curves and grades that should have forced them to slow dramatically. And despite their enormous bulk, they were surprisingly gentle on rails thanks to well-distributed weight and balanced drivers. Track inspectors repeatedly noted that big boys caused fewer issues than many smaller locomotives. Even diesel advocates within Union Pacific grew hesitant. If steam still excelled in the most punishing terrain, was it really wise to retire these machines? The big boy had already silenced its early critics, but now it was challenging a much larger narrative, one that claimed steam's time was over. And it wasn't finished yet. By the mid-1950s, steam's twilight was undeniable. Diesel locomotives were improving, maintenance costs were falling, and railroads nationwide were eager for modernization. But even as steam locomotives disappeared from the rosters coast to coast, the big boys remained. They were the final holdouts, massive, unapologetic reminders of an engineering philosophy that pushed limits instead of conforming to practicality. Gradually, even Union Pacific had to accept what was coming. Diesels could run longer without servicing. They didn't require massive water towers, coal facilities, or roundhouse crews. And while they still couldn't match the big boys' sheer muscle, economics, not engineering, was now deciding the future. But before retirement came, the big boys made sure their legacy could never be questioned. In their final years, they continued setting performance marks no locomotive has truly duplicated. They hauled enormous wartime trains across the Wasatch. They pushed tonnage that diesels struggled to equal even with multiple units. And they did it with a consistency that bordered on myth. Railroad photographers rushed to capture their last runs. Some climbed ridges overlooking the mountain passes, waiting for the distant thunder of the 16 drivers. Others followed the engines in cars, racing dirt roads to catch one more shot of a colossus at full stride. Townspeople stood beside the tracks, waving as the big boys charged past, aware they were witnessing the end of an era. When retirement finally came in 1959, it wasn't because they were outdated, it was because the world had changed. Railroads no longer valued brute force above all else. Efficiency, standardization, and lower operating costs dictated the new landscape. And so one by one, the big boys were pulled from service, their fires dropped, their cabs grown cold. Yet something remarkable happened. As soon as they were gone, people missed them. Rival rail companies that once mocked the design now openly acknowledged its brilliance. Historians labeled the big boy the pinnacle of steam engineering. Railfans treated the surviving locomotives like sacred artifacts, and in 2019, decades after anyone expected it, Union Pacific restored Big Boy number 4014 to operation, letting the giant thunder across the West once more. Every skeptic was proven wrong, every doubter silenced. The big boy wasn't just a locomotive, it was a scolement, one written in steel, steam, and sheer defiance. A reminder that sometimes the world's greatest achievements begin with being told they're impossible. Even decades after their retirement, the legend of the big boy continued to grow. For many rail fans, it wasn't enough to see one on display. They wanted to understand why this locomotive captured imaginations long after the era of steam had vanished. What made the big boy different? Why did it stand out among thousands of locomotives built in the first half of the 20th century? The answers weren't found in raw horsepower alone. They were found in the union of scale, purpose, and timing. The big boy emerged at the one moment in railroad history when steam engineering reached its absolute peak. Metallurgy had advanced, manufacturing precision improved. Engineers understood airflow, combustion, and boiler efficiency better than ever. And most importantly, the demands of wartime freight pushed railroads to the brink of their capabilities. The big boy wasn't a symbol of excess. It was a necessary evolution born under extraordinary pressure. Railroad historians often compare steam technology to a candle burning brightest just before it goes out. And in that brief, brilliant moment, the big boy was the flame. It represented everything steam could possibly become before dieselization changed the landscape forever. The timing was almost poetic. The world's largest and most powerful steam locomotive appeared just before steam died. Yet the big boy's appeal isn't only technical, it's emotional. There is something undeniably compelling about a machine this massive, this powerful, moving with such confidence. Engineers who ran them often spoke of the locomotive as if it had a personality. It wasn't unusual to hear phrases like, "She climbs like she's alive," or "She talks to you through the throttle." This wasn't romantic embellishment. Crews truly felt connected to these engines in a way modern locomotives rarely inspire. That connection became even more profound after Union Pacific restored Big Boy number 14. When the locomotive returned to life, thousands of people lined the route, men and women who had never witnessed a steam locomotive in service, children who had only seen them in books. Even people with no interest in railroads found themselves drawn to the spectacle. They weren't just watching a machine, they were witnessing living history. Because the big boy represents more than horsepower charts or engineering diagrams. It represents the ambition of an era when railroads dared to build on a scale that bordered on unbelievable. When solving a problem meant pushing limits instead of minimizing them. When the mountains of the West were not obstacles to avoid, but challenges to conquer. And that spirit, bold, unapologetic, and larger than life, is why the big boy remains the ultimate icon of American railroading. Even after the last fires were dropped and the big boys were parked in roundhouses awaiting their fate, something unexpected happened, something no railroad executive predicted. Instead of fading quietly into the background of history, the big boys began attracting crowds, not just rail fans, but families, school groups, veterans, machinists, and former railroad workers. People traveled hundreds of miles just to stand beneath the towering boiler, touch the massive drive wheels, and imagine what it must have been like to see such a machine in motion. Museums quickly learned that whenever a big boy was added to their collection, attendance spiked. Tour guides often found themselves answering the same question over and over. Why did they stop using it? And the explanation was never simple. It wasn't that the big boys failed, it wasn't that they wore out, it wasn't that they were surpassed by better steam locomotives. The truth was more complicated. Steam power had reached perfection at the exact moment the world no longer needed it. But even as dieselization swept the country, railroaders couldn't bring themselves to cut up every big boy. A handful were preserved in Cheyenne, Dallas, Denver, Omaha, St. Louis, and other cities. They became landmarks, giant monuments to a time when engineering was measured not by efficiency, but by ambition. Then something truly extraordinary happened. In 2013, Union Pacific announced a plan that sounded impossible. They were bringing one back to life. Big Boy, number 4014, silent, for half a century, was moved from a museum to the Cheyenne steam shops. Engineers spent years inspecting every bearing, tube, flue, piston, valve, and brace. Welding crews rebuilt the firebox. Modern systems were integrated carefully without compromising authenticity. Rail fans worldwide held their breath, unsure whether the project could truly succeed. And then, in May 2019, with steam rising from its safety valves and sunlight shimmering across its black boiler, Big Boy number 4014 took its first steps under its own power. Thousands lined the tracks. Millions watched online. The earth shook once more as the locomotive thundered across the plains, proving that the spirit of steam was not dead. It was simply waiting for the right moment to roar again. That moment confirmed something people had long suspected. The big boy wasn't just a machine. It was a legend, and legends don't stay silent forever. Today, long after their working years ended, the big boys remain symbols of something rare. A moment when engineering wasn't limited by caution, cost, or convention. A moment when a team of designers looked at the impossible and built it anyway. Visitors who stand beside a big boy often say the same thing. Pictures don't do it justice. They're right. Photographs can't capture the weight in the air when you stand beside the driving wheels. They can't capture the deep echo under your feet. They can't recreate the feeling of a machine built not just to haul freight, but to conquer mountains. And perhaps that's why the big boy endures. Not because of its size, not because of its records, but because it represents an age when America believed no challenge was too great to overcome with steel, steam, and determination. The critics who mocked it have been forgotten. The locomotive they doubted lives on. And 4014, the last big boy to breathe, still thunders across the country, reminding us that some legends were never meant to die.